Well, this will be, I think, a fascinating conversation. Brandon Ambrosino, it is great to have you. You're an award-winning journalist. You wrote a book, Is It God's Will? Making Sense of Tragedy, Luck, and Hope in a World Gone Wrong. Very light reading, light topics. Certainly have very easy answers. Thanks for making time. It means a lot.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be meeting you and to be chatting with you.
Tell me a bit about your story. From what I read, it says that you were in the Pentecostal world for a while, then went Catholic. What a jump. Yeah. So I'm just kind of curious. Give me some of your background.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up Pentecostal, Church of God from Cleveland. And then I ended up at Liberty University, Baptist College. I always joke and say, I followed my then girlfriend there, and when we got there, we decided it was best if we saw other boys. So we decided to do that. But that's how I got there, and that's where I first started studying religion and theology. And then after once I got there and I came out to teachers, ended up in conversion therapy.
Oof,
it was maybe conversion therapy light. It did not feel as traumatizing as, I've heard stories of people who had shock therapy. So mine was much milder, but the effects of that are still lasting. Mm-hmm. So it was a lot to take. I ended up dropping out after 3.5 years. I had to go back years later to finish the degree. But in the meantime, I started worshiping at an Episcopal church, and that sort of opened the door to Catholicism for me. I guess the final nudge was when I moved to Delaware. I wanted to study theology. So, Villanova's like an hour away, so I decided I would come here, and I just fell in love with the Augustinians. I fell in love with my teachers. I fell in love with the sisters. And I just felt like I was being called to be Catholic. And the overlap, you had mentioned, the giant leap from Pentecostalism to Catholicism. For me, they're very similar with their focus on the Spirit. Like both Catholics and Pentecostals, I think, have a really strong pneumatology. A lot of other Pentecostal theology, I think, is lacking, but at least on that front, I think it's pretty good. So that's how I got here.
Okay, so are you still at Villanova then?
Yeah, that's where we are right now. I just moved into this office, actually. Last year I was teaching in the humanities department, and this year I'm back in the theology department.
Well, I live right over the bridge in New Jersey from Philadelphia, so I'm very close to Philly. Yeah, I'm
really.
I used to, my old house, which is 5 minutes up the road, I could walk to the Delaware River and see Pennsylvania. I mean, that's how close I am. So wow. Philly is my stomping ground. Go Birds all the way. Okay. I'm right there. So yeah, we'll have to connect outside of this for sure. And I will need to borrow some of your fashion sense. You got to address me, my friend, because I got nothing going on over here. And I love the vibe.
Tops. Thank you. I appreciate that.
You know what's interesting? I'm going to put my cards on the table with Catholicism. So I grew up evangelical, very fundamentalist, more John MacArthur type of theology. Then I found charismatic churches because I was a drummer, and they had all the cool worship music. They were singing David Crowder and Hillsong and all that stuff. So I've kind of been around in evangelicalism on both sides of that question. And I will say, it is funny now watching the John MacArthur types be like, those Catholics aren't really Christian, when the Catholic faith precedes Protestantism by 1,000+ years. It is kind of ironic, But I will say this, and I'm kind of curious your thoughts. I find myself full of contradictions. On one hand, there's something very attractive to me about Catholicism. It's how it's rooted, its ancientness, its vast depth of theology and its theologians, its liturgy, the Mass being centered on the Eucharist, not on the sermon. I'm like, that sounds beautiful, because evangelicalism, as I'm sure you know, it doesn't really root you into anything as like super traditional in a healthy sense, right? Modern evangelicalism is so disjointed, I think, from the Christian tradition in general. I mean, I didn't even know, this is so embarrassing, I didn't even know that the church calendar was a thing until like 5 years ago. Like, wait, what's a church calendar, right? Anyway, I say all this because on one hand, I'm very attracted to Catholicism. On the other hand, I miss modern worship. Like I miss the songs. I fully admit it. Okay. I miss the emotions. I miss the big drum builds. I miss the lights. I do. Like I have such a hard time feeling that connection to the divine in like what is to me, because I've been trained by evangelicalism, a very bland and dry sense of like musicality. And that's my tension. Full transparency.
Yeah, I love that. I am right there with you. So, I grew up Pentecostal. We had drums. I actually grew up tap dancing. I was a tap dancer before I went to grad school. So I always considered myself a percussionist. Yes, we have almost no percussion in Catholic Mass. So I do miss that. I will say, depending on where you are going to Mass in the world, they might have drums. So there are some Catholic congregations that are much more charismatic than other ones. I mean, the charismatic movement happened in the Catholic Church.
Right.
But yeah, we don't have the drums. We don't have the lights. I do miss that. The first Catholic church I worshiped at was St. Ignatius in Baltimore. Brilliant priest. I loved this man. And this Baltimore parish was known for starting the first Pride Mass in the U.S. Wow. So it was really a very strong parish. However, because Baltimore has the Peabody Music Conservatory, which is affiliated with Johns Hopkins, all of the musicians were doctoral students in the conservatory. So the music, it wasn't like drums and everything, but it was like going to a concert and hearing a symphony every Sunday. It really was stellar.
No, that does sound amazing. So I hope I can ask, you're a gay man, right? You found that you like boys in Liberty University. Totally great, totally fair. And you're Catholic. Now that's very interesting to me. I would love for you to maybe kind of explain to the audience, like how you navigate both of those things. Because I'll be honest, I know very little about Catholicism. I do know that there are some Catholic movements that are fully inclusive and affirming, but they're not really seen as part of like the main Roman Catholicism, if I'm not mistaken. You're the expert. So I'm just kind of curious, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that is the question, right? I think, so it's funny because here at Villanova, each student has to take an intro to theology class. And in an effort to try and, respect the diversity on our campus, we offer 3 different versions of that class. So one is faith and culture, which everybody assumes I teach. The other is interreligious dialogue. And the third is Catholic studies. And I teach Catholic studies. And usually the students who go to that class have been, educated K through 12 in Catholic schools. And so they show up to class and I'm like, hi, I can't really turn it on or turn it off. It's just, there's one level and it's this. And so I think they're sort of shocked about that. At the same time, like I've got my catechism. I teach from the catechism. We were talking about Thomas last week. We'll talk about Augustine today. So I really am engaging the tradition. There is a tension that exists between being Catholic and being a married gay man. I also want to say one of the best things of Pope Francis's papacy was his encouragement to be a very local Catholic. So he called himself the Bishop of Rome when he first introduced himself, right? Not the Pope of the world, but the Bishop of Rome. And so he really did oppose this clericalism where everything was taking place. All of these discussions were taking place at the highest levels of institutions. So I say that because when people say, well, what does the Catholic Church think about you being gay? I say, well, which Catholic Church? I mean, the one that my husband and I go to, they're okay with it. I became Catholic when I was engaged to Andy, and my priest allowed Andy to be my confirmation sponsor, which makes him a godfather, or in gay language, we would say a goddaddy. He's my goddaddy. So it just depends, It's not a problem here, but I do recognize that I have the privilege of being on a college campus. All of our priests here have graduate degrees. Many have doctorates. So it's just a different vibe. But even at the church I go to in Delaware, the priest doesn't have a doctorate, but they're still very respectful. I will say, I think a lot of the disrespect and the homophobia I have heard from Catholics has been online, on social media. Sometimes there will be very anti-gay priests with big social media followings who will like tweet out, or what do you call it now, X out. They'll share one of my stories and they'll sort of start a pile-on. But I do have to say, I've never really gone to a Catholic church and felt excluded. I've never seen that. I've never faced that homophobia in person. I have faced it in Southern Baptist churches. I have faced that. So I don't know. I mean, it's interesting too, because, Catholics in this country tend to be Democrats. They tend to be progressive. Catholics as a bloc, as a political bloc, tend to support gay marriage. More Catholics support gay marriage than don't. So there is a tension there, but I think the tension is theological. Obviously, I'm a theologian, so I want to dig into that. At the same time, I still think one of the beauties of the Eucharist is that we can put the theology on hold for the moment and still gather around the table that we've all been called to.
I love that. Do you think in your view, do you think that like the Catholic Church as an entity can head in a direction where its stance is officially more inclusive and affirming as opposed to how it stands now? Like, do you think that's possible? A lot of us in the evangelical world or the post-evangelical world or new evangelical world, right? We get asked that question about the white evangelical church, and I have all kinds of answers to that question. It depends on what day, and how I'm feeling. I'm just kind of curious for you how you think about it on the Catholic side.
Yeah, I think the church, and there's just one universal church, right? But I think the church is God's church, and the future is God's future. So I do think the church is being called into more inclusion, and I do hope that it will get there. And I'm kind of putting my money on the fact that it will, because it is God's church, and God's lore is irresistible. Institutions and structures take a very, very, very long time to change. But there are signs of life. There are signs of change. I was last year, so I dedicated my book to my goddaughters and their mother, and they lost their father. He was 44 years old. He died of a heart attack last year. But a month before that, my husband and I were at their church in Florida for their baptism. We're their godparents. And so I had to fill out the form, and the official form for godparents. One of the questions is, are you married? And then the follow-up question is, if you're married, is your marriage recognized by the Roman Catholic Church? And I wrote no. And my priest here still, gave it the what do they call it? The seal. And the Florida priest still let me do it. So it's like we have all of this institutional paperwork and red tape that we're like, okay, we're doing for some reason. But the lived reality is all Catholics know there's a bunch of gay people. If they know the music minister, okay, they get the guys who sing in the choir. They understand that the guy who's putting beautiful flowers all over the altar, like they get it,
I love that. No, that's great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that answer. I'm always curious to hear how other folks think about this stuff. So you wrote a book, Is It God's Will? Actually, I'll pull it up here on the screen so we can see it together. I think it's this button, if I'm not mistaken. There we go. Is It God's Will? Making sense of tragedy, luck, and hope in a world gone wrong. It came out, yesterday. Congratulations, as of this recording.
Thank you.
September 9th. I mean, it's not easy work to write a book. Congratulations on the book coming out. That's awesome. I do want to dig into this question. I mean, this is a big question. And like I said earlier, I grew up in a more John MacArthur tradition originally, so very Calvinist. God has predetermined all things that should come to pass. R.C. Sproul, there's not one rogue molecule. Then you discover that maybe the charismatics are like, well, it's not really that strict. Maybe we have some choice in the matter. And then I've come across process theology and open and relational theology. And I'm like, okay, maybe God just can't stop evil, as my friend Tom Ord would say. And we have an obligation as humans to partner with God to, as time is unfolding, moment by moment, to be compelled by the love of God that draws us into something deeper and better, etc. Okay, that kind of helps me answer the problem of evil. So I would just love, your general thesis for why you wrote this book, and then we can dig into some of the nuances.
Great, thanks. So a couple of things happened. Two big things. One was last summer, my friend dropped dead of a heart attack. That was really tough. His daughters were 10 months old and 2.
Oh, goodness.
And so we were driving home from Maine, and we got the call, and we just flew right down to be with them. And we were there for a week. And our second night there, we had to tell the 2-year-old, her daddy's not coming home. And they're Catholic. That was really tough. And my friend, her mom took the lead, and she did a great job. But as I was listening to her, the theologian in me was just sort of going, well, not quite, well, that's no. But then I was just like, this is not a moment for theology. It's a moment for comfort. And I think theology is doing its best work when it is providing that comfort. So I just listened, but it still weighed on me, right? And it weighed on me because I had already been thinking about, God's role with the world. A couple of months prior, I wrote something for the Christian Century about the almost assassination of President Trump. And it was called something like, Did God Save President Trump? That's what it was. Because, a lot of, I know you have a lot of friends who are evangelical, post-evangelical. That's the world I grew up in, even though Pentecostal, they check many of the same boxes. Yeah. And they were all just saying, wow, God saved Trump's life. And that was so troubling to me because I thought, what a stupid way to save somebody's life by killing somebody else. Surely God, who is infinitely bright and wise, could have come up with a better way to do it, right? Also, why did he wait so long to intervene? Why didn't he see the guy climbing up, on the roof and knock the ladder down, right? Or better yet, why didn't God move this guy's heart at the very beginning to not even go that day to the rally? Why do we say God intervened just at this moment? Because it was the stupidest intervention at all. So I had just written this, I was getting a lot of feedback on it, and then my friend died. So Carl, the editor of this book, whom I adore, emailed me, and he said, I saw this essay. I was wondering if you would want to turn it into a book. And I thought, oh my God, yes, I have to, because I just really want to work through my own reflections on this. I want to try to make sense. I'm a Christian. I have hope for the future. I do have hope that we're going to be reunited with Carl. I do have hope that the church will be more inclusive. I do have hope that the kingdom of God does break into this world and disrupt everything that is opposed to the kingdom of God. And I've got to be realistic in a way because it's not happening yet. And the world seems to have gone not only wrong, but spectacularly wrong. Right. So how do I come to terms with that? So the book sort of came out of that line of reflection.
No, I love that. I think this book will be really needed and good for our audience because I can tell you, as someone who tracks Christian nationalism for a living, goes to those events, I'm asking myself the same question. God, where were you in Minneapolis, right? When that person took the lives of children who were praying to the Christian God? What's going on with that? How does this work? Why are we? I think about it in terms of timelines. Out of all the possible timelines, we're in this one. Like how? Like really?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
We're watching what's happening in Gaza. I mean, it's just it's unbelievable. Like all the different layers and things that are happening in the world. And so, I mean, where do you start then? I mean, obviously, you don't have to give away the whole book, but like as far as your personal reflections, I'll be honest with you, Brandon. I really wrestle with this one big time. I really struggle with this. I think that this concept is a huge it's a really tough thing, and I don't have good answers. I'm not even sure if it's about answers. I don't know, but I'm kind of curious when you look around at the world, how you think about God and their role in all of this.
Yeah, so because I'm a Christian, I go right to Jesus.
Yep.
Um, God's revelation is not primarily about God's will, it's about God's love. And the Christian tradition has always said, if you want to know what God's love is like,
Right.
look to Jesus. Not Jesus when he's at his best, but Jesus when he's bleeding out on a cross, nude, broken body, wounded. That is Jesus. Or that is God. That's God's love. That's the revelation of God's love. So that's my starting point. How does that show me the love of God, right? Now, Christians have tried to get their minds around this, and the answer that they usually give is, well, it's love because Jesus chose to die that way so that God could forgive us.
Right.
Jesus chose to die so that God could have a better relationship with us.
That's right.
Or something. This is always troubling to me. Elizabeth Johnson, a Catholic theologian, says, why does something have to happen in order for God to forgive us? She says, Jesus doesn't say, if somebody asks your forgiveness, go kill someone and then forgive them, right? Jesus is telling us, just do it. If somebody asks, just do it. So why can't God just do it? Right? And then why can't God just forgive us? Why does Jesus have to die for it? And then evangelicals say, well, this is what C.S. Lewis in Narnia calls the deep magic. This is just how it works. But then I'm sitting here like, okay, but why does it work that way? God is responsible for the world. God created a world. Why couldn't he create a world in which it was possible for him to forgive somebody without murdering somebody innocent?
Right.
So at the same time, the cross is important. I'm fidgeting with my cross right here, by the way, which my friend got me from Paris. The cross is important. There is no Christianity without it, I believe. Yeah. So what do we do? Well, I think what we do is we have to do better history here. And I'm not a Jesus scholar. I'm not a New Testament historian or anything. I just so happen to read them a lot. And there's this lovely book by Paula Fredrickson called Jesus of Nazareth. And this book, I don't know if it's based on this article she wrote earlier, but it comes out of this article. Well, it comes after this article where she sort of discusses what she'll go on to argue in this book. And it's basically something like this. And hang on, because I'm going to get nerdy, but I promise we'll get back to your question.
Let's get nerdy. Go for it.
Yes. Okay, awesome. So she says, the historical question is not so much why Jesus was killed, but why weren't his disciples killed? And this is a question other Jesus historians have asked. And it's a very good it's a very good historical question, because I think Jesus scholars, their instinct here is to say, well, Jesus was killed because he was a threat to the state. But Paula says, if his movement was a threat to the state would have put down the whole thing, but they don't do it. So why did they kill just Jesus? Now, I cannot reconstruct her entire argument because I'm not a historian. I've read it many times. I cover it in the book. I summarize it a little bit, and I quote her. But she says something like this. And by the way, she reconstructs Jesus's murder by using John, which is something a lot of Bible scholars would not do. They would, because it's a later gospel, they would try to reconstruct the events on the synoptics. But she turns her eyes on John. And she says something like, Pilate knew that Jesus was no threat whatsoever because his teachings actually were very respectful to the state in some ways. He said, if a Roman authority forces you to carry his bags, don't do it for just 1 mile, go the second mile with him, right? That's where that comes from. So she says his ideas of loving your enemies, of forgiving people, of helping people out, of charity, these were not in any way threatening to the state, right? But she says what might have happened on that last Passover when he was killed is that maybe he was talking about the kingdom of God, and the pilgrims, the holiday pilgrims, in their fervor and their zeal, maybe they misunderstood him because, see, they were pilgrims. They weren't from there. So maybe they were not familiar with Jesus's message. So maybe when he said things like the kingdom of God is at hand, maybe they thought, oh, good, he's a warlord. He's going to lead this radical uprising against Rome. Awesome. Right. So Pilate then, and maybe some of the Jewish leaders get worried, like, uh-oh, we know Jesus is not a threat to Rome, but these people don't. And they're sort of here for a holiday. They're already very enthusiastic, and now now unrest is taking them. What do we do? And so what Paulus suggests is killing Jesus was very strategic. Pilate just said, look, let's kill him. Let's put him on a cross. This way, we'll just cut the thing off before it gets going, right? We'll disabuse them of any idea that Jesus is the Messiah. So that's what happened, she says. Now, I like this reconstruction because what it suggests is that Jesus's death was sort of a chance occurrence, right? It happened because at a specific time and in a specific place with specific actors, things started to go wrong. And that's why the state said, just kill him, right? Maybe it didn't happen at other times, right? It didn't. We know that. He was only killed once. So I think that's glorious from a theological standpoint, because what it does is it drains the cross of any suggestion of intention. The cross no longer represents what God intended for Jesus to suffer. The cross instead represents a pure instance of bad luck in a world gone wrong. And as a theologian, I say, that is where I can hang my hope, because what the cross teaches me is God stands in solidarity with all of the unfortunate, with anyone who has suffered the worst bad luck. That is where God is. So that is my starting point, really, for this book.
Okay, very interesting. So does that mean that for you, like, there are forces outside of what God, I guess, can and can't control, or did God set things up like a certain way where there's a bit of randomness to it? Like, how do you think it? Because again, forgive me, but I'm so stuck in like my evangelical ways. I've only been taught like, well, either God's all powerful and all good, or He's not. Like, which is it? So I'm just kind of curious for you, like, how you think about, I guess, or how you conceptualize God and God's power to control outcomes, I guess, right? Because, and that goes back to my initial, like, my own tension of just like, if God is predestining every single action, I think God's a moral monster, frankly, right? Because like so many things are happening that are horrible. At the same time, it seems like the other alternate option is, well, God just isn't as powerful as we all thought, and we're kind of at the forces of the chaotic waters, so to speak, that we hear about, in the Genesis account. So like what's your take on that?
I want to reframe God's notions of God's power. So God is powerful. The cross, the reason I have a cross here is because Jesus' story does not end with the cross, right? So the power of God consists in the fact that even when everything goes wrong, God can show up to a tomb and not allow that tragedy to have the final word, right?
I like that. Yeah.
So, yeah, for me, that's very comforting. If the end of the story was just the cross, I wouldn't really, that's not grounds for hope, right?
Right.
But God can show up. So it's not that God allows these terrible things, or is, controlling these terrible things as they happen, but it's that God is capable of responding to the world's seriousness on his own terms. And the terms he has chosen to respond to these things with are terms of life and terms of love, right? I wrote my dissertation on camp, and I have a second book coming out next year on camp theology. And camp is all about throwing the serious in quotation marks, throwing the world in quotation marks, right? Finding the excess of what might be there. And so this is what God does with Jesus's murder. He finds the excess of death. And the excess of death here is resurrection. So I don't want to get rid of any concept of God's power. I just want to reframe it. God's power consists in God's potential, right? And so long as there is potential for more, then we can hope for a world that is otherwise.
No, that is helpful. Yeah, that is a powerful reframing that I think I'll have to chew on and really think about, because that makes sense. That maybe it's not that God isn't powerful, but how God's power operates is different than how we might think it does, right? This idea, like you said, of how the cross doesn't have the final say. It's the resurrection that does, because God's power is a redeeming, it's a regenerative, it's a life-giving kind of thing. How do you think or imagine, God, or however we're thinking about this, divine presence showing up in the middle of tragedy? I think that this is really difficult. As you were telling the story, I have two kids, they're 3 and 5, and so you can't help but put yourself in the shoes of those children and that mother who lost their father and husband unexpectedly. That is, it's it made me very, very emotional. Like it really hit me hard to think about that. And obviously it happened, and we hope that God's regenerative power will work in the world, whether in the here and now or in the future. But that still leaves a gap, right, of time when there is immense pain and feeling that we have to navigate and think about in the face of tragedy. How do you talk about that in your book?
So I do a close reading of Psalm 82, which is my favorite passage in the Bible. And this is where a lot of sociologists and historians believe that this psalm shows in mythical form how Israel, or the people who became Israel, transitioned from polytheistic to monotheistic. So God, the God who becomes the one God, overthrows the divine council simply by outloving them. He says, this really gets me, sorry. He says, all of you have failed the people that you are charged with protecting. You failed the orphans and widows. So, and he says, because of it, because you are not walking in compassion and justice, because you're taking bribes, because you're failing the poor and needy, the entire world is falling apart, and I'm not going to risk that. So he no-gods them, right? He just declares their death. He says, like one of the princes you shall fall. And then he becomes the God who inherits the earth. He is the one God who takes responsibility for everyone. I think there's a lot of wisdom in thinking of God as a parent, as a father and a mother. As you know, both moves are legitimate, especially in Scripture.
Yes.
But I'm not a parent yet. I do hope that I will be one day. You are a parent, and I know you're a very loving parent. And I think the thing is, when you are a parent, you can't really control outcomes for your kid, right? And we would all say, yeah, duh. But that has nothing to do with whether or not you love them, right? Whether you love them, you can protect them from harm. They might wind up in a hospital room one day, but your salt as a parent is whether you show up to the hospital with them.
Right.
And God does. God does show up with us in our moments of need. So I don't know why we wouldn't say, oh, can you believe that 6-year-old got cancer? Her parents must hate her, right? That has nothing to do with it, right? That tragedies happen to children has nothing to do with whether or not their parents love them. Some of the time, right?
Right.
If they're being abused, if they're being rejected, but in general.
Right.
I think it's very similar to God. I just think God's love consists in being with us in our moments of dire need, right? And again, I think the reason I have hope in this God is because of the resurrection, right? There's a quote I use in my book. Pope Benedict says, either love is stronger than death or it isn't. And I think, in Christianity, we see this hope for eternal relationship expressed very clearly. And that's where the idea of resurrection comes from. That's where the idea of heaven comes from, that God loves us so much that he's not willing to let that relationship go ever. Yeah. So these are just a few disconnected thoughts that are coming up for me.
I like them. They're wonderful. I also do wonder, and this is me, I'm really opining here. This is just, I'm feeling the vibe of the conversation. So I'm gonna say something that I can't prove, but I do wonder how much of our modern notions of God are a projection of our attempt to want to control things that we can't control, right? And having a scapegoat of like, who can we blame for tragedy? And it's a very real thing. I mean, look, no one wants children to have cancer, but kids do get cancer. And we think about how does such a bad thing happen to someone so innocent, right? And so I appreciate like your reframing of how even I conceptualize God, or how we think about God and God's love and God's redeeming qualities, and kind of comparing it to a parent, because you're right. As a parent, I will tell you, my kids do get hurt sometimes, and it's not because I don't love them. In fact, sometimes, when I the way our house is laid out, we have a deck, and our deck is very close to a lower part of the roof that the kids have climbed on before. And there have been times where I've caught them, and they're kind of on like the very pinnacle of the roof, not on the top of our house. It's maybe like maybe 8-10 feet off the ground, but it's still a big drop, and the other side is concrete. And there have been times where I've been like, get off the roof. Like, I've yelled, not because I'm mad at them, but because I'm so worried about them falling off the roof that I need to like grab them as soon as possible, right? But then there are times too where we let them play with each other, and then one comes in crying because the other one, pinched the other one too hard, or they got into a fight on the trampoline. And you still want to be the parent that's there when they get the boo-boos, right? That doesn't mean that I don't love my kids any less. It just means that they have agency that I can't control, right? I can't control who they are. And if I did, I probably wouldn't be seen as a great parent if I was a micromanaging, all-controlling parent trying to make them into robots. So I appreciate that. I want to change gears a little bit on the topic, but still with the theme of this book. Let's talk about Christian nationalism for a second, because we are watching, like you said, use the word spectacular, like how bad things are going, and I concur. I mean, we're watching our immigrant neighbors being kidnapped. We're watching queer rights being attempted to be minimized. As you probably painfully know, for some people, Obergefell was back on the table to try and I mean, it's bad. It's bad stuff. Women's suffrage for some people now is a thing. It is not good. And it all seems to be empowered by this current regime that is being fueled by this Christian nationalist agenda that's been working for a long time. And unfortunately, in my tradition, and I think in part of yours as well, in the charismatic world, with like the New Apostolic Reformation, et cetera. And so how do we think about, God and God's, is it God's will? Is it not? Or like, do you kind of see Christian nationalists as trying to be gods themselves to kind of control outcomes, and is the God you're talking about one that works kind of underneath the boot of all of this and is always subversive and never one who's power hungry? How do you think about that? I'm just really curious.
No, thanks for this. I mean, I do think a lot about, Christian nationalism, many different sociologists write about it, historians. Again, I can't think of it from that perspective, but I do think what's missing is theological reflection, because a lot of aspects of evangelical theology that some of which I have difficulty swallowing, some of which are absolutely abhorrent to me, like hell, like an all-powerful God who rules by fiat,
Yeah.
right? Like a God who sentences someone innocent to death so that something good can happen. These are theological ideas, but they are in the background, or maybe they serve as the philosophical foundation for a lot of the ideas that are very near and dear to the hearts of Christian nationalists, right? So a belief in an eternal hell sits very comfortably with a carceral police state.
Right.
A belief in God sending Jesus to be murdered, right? God sending Jesus with the sole intention of being murdered. This sits very comfortably with the idea of redemptive violence and us needing to sacrifice a few thousand or million troops so that we can have freedom. Those are the same theological ideas, right? And so what I think we need to do is, and I have a piece, I don't know if it's out today or maybe tomorrow, in Christian Century, where I was really bothered by, I'm sure you heard of this, in the end of August, an Amish woman throwing her 4-year-old in an Ohio River because God was testing her and God told her to do that. Earlier that morning, she says God was testing her husband and he had to go prove his worthiness to God and swim, and he drowned, and I brought this up to my class, and one of the students said, well, that sounds like that guy in the Bible who has to sacrifice his son to God. I was like, oh, it does sound like Abraham and Isaac in Genesis 22. The outcomes are different, but the theological premises are similar. So the question that came up for me, especially as a theologian, was, oh my God, is our theology, has it become deadly?
Right.
There's a way of doing theology in the direction of life, and there's a way of doing theology in the direction of death.
That's right.
And I think a lot of what we would consider pop American mainstream evangelical theology is theology in the direction of death. And that concerns me. And so, yes, I think sociologists and historians need to be doing their thing. And also, anybody who just goes to a church that doesn't buy into this stuff, we need to be asking ourselves seriously, are the theological ideas that we've long considered sacred, is it easy for them to dead end in this nationalism, in this white supremacy, in these exclusivistic impulses? If so, we need to rethink them, not like next year, not like in 5 years from now, but like yesterday. We need to do it immediately.
100%. I wrote on my personal Substack at Tim Whitaker Speaks a Christian Nationalism 101 explainer. It's kind of like a broad overview. Maybe it's a 15-minute read, just trying to get people, here's the general lay of the land. And one of the points I make is that, look, we have to be honest about something. Perhaps Christian nationalists are obsessed with Trump because he reflects the version of God that they worship. A vengeful, cruel, destroy your enemies, I need 24/7 praise, loyalty or else, kind of God. And I think there's a real link there, honestly, because I have thought about, not in the language that you use, but I have thought about about the theology I was given about the Bible and about hell and about justice, and how it seems to really fit well into the Christian nationalist ideal. I mean, the way that they're able to really hijack the biblical text, and especially, I'm sure you noticed, they rarely quote Jesus. They rarely. Unless we're talking about gay marriage and they pull Matthew 7, Matthew 25 out of context, that's the only time they really quote Jesus. They never quote him when it comes to loving one's enemies or feeding the hungry, clothing the naked. Nothing about liberating the oppressed. It's always like the Hebrew Bible they're pulling from, or maybe something from Paul. And I think that's intentional, because you have to really treat the Bible like Swiss cheese and kind of pick out the different parts that you want to come away with this message that the God you worship, apparently the God of the Bible, wants you to kidnap immigrants and throw them into concentration camps. Somehow that is the Christian ethic. It's like, I'm no biblical scholar like someone else in this conversation, but there's a pretty big theme consistently throughout the Hebrew and New Testament about welcoming the foreigner and treating the foreigner as like one of yours. You have to do a lot of gymnastics to avoid that and go, well, we have to deport these people because they're destroying America, right? But there is, Scott Coley calls it, what's motivated literalism is what he calls it. And it's this idea of like, evangelicals are motivated to be biblical literalists as long as it serves their predetermined outcomes, which is why they can say that Jesus didn't really mean what he said when he said that it's harder for a rich man, right, to go through, camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to go into heaven, essentially, or the kingdom. But Genesis 1 and 2 are literal, examples of how are literal descriptions of how the earth was formed, so science is garbage and evolution doesn't exist, right? Motivated literalism. One serves our outcome, the other one doesn't. One is just an analogy about the heart, and one is literal. And I think that's a huge piece that there have been some writings on it, but it hasn't been nearly as explored as like the sociological side and the historical side of Christian nationalism, in my opinion.
Yeah, and just the idea of hermeneutics here, right? I don't want to bash anybody's reading strategies, right? But it does seem to me that like a lot of people who say no, you can't, issue a creative reading of this biblical text. What God said, what Moses wrote is done, binding for all time. A lot of them, it seems, also make the same move when it comes to like the Constitution and like the Second Amendment. So there is, I think it's, again, other people look to other things like sociology or psychology. I look to the theology. It's the theological, they've been formed to relate to texts in a certain way.
Yeah.
And I do relate to the text of Scripture. I do find myself summoned by the God under whose pressure the Scriptures came to be. I love these Scriptures, but I definitely had to reevaluate with what my relationship with these texts is going to be, and I think that's why we really need pastors, like you, people who are really thinking through this stuff. It's so easy to start a church in the United States. I mean, I have family members who go to a church pastored by this person who's just like, oh, I want to start a church. And it's like, okay, that's great. And I guess you have the freedom to do that. But we really, it's incumbent on Christians to really evaluate what the relationship with the text is. And I think that good pastors, good teachers can really help us do that.
Yeah, what would be, this might be a great question to kind of land on. What would be, there are a lot of people listening to this who are probably a few years into maybe thinking about faith differently for the first time. They kind of grew up how we did, and they're kind of out of the basement into the house of Christian faith and going, wow, there's a lot of rooms to explore. And also they want to treat these things seriously. They don't want to be anti-intellectual with how they approach the text. They don't want to repeat the same kind of dogmatic positions that they inherited, but just with different themes, right? What's your recommendation to folks who might want to get started to better understand the Bible and kind of get into the world of theology in a responsible manner, as opposed to maybe how they were told initially?
Good question. I mean, I always come back to tradition, but I also, Pope Benedict, before he was Benedict, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, he wrote this really lovely thing, and it was like, he said something like, there are two traditions in the Christian faith. One is a legitimate tradition, and one is a distorting tradition. And part of our faith requires us to find out which is which. So I would tell people, dive headlong into the tradition, right? But do it, maybe do it with with a community of believers, right? I think that's also something that people miss. The idea of canonicity tells us that texts ought to be read in community, in relationships, right?
Right.
Texts are relational things, right? Texts come to be when they are picked up and read by groups of people. So I would say find a community, but also find a community who is really sort of frustrated with how the world is turning out, but who simultaneously hopes that the world can turn out differently. One of the difficult things for me, as a theologian, sometimes I go to these conferences and all you hear is just this pessimism, and you hear a lot of criticism, a lot of rebuke, and I'm all for that. And we cannot forget that our faith begins when God walks into a tomb and says, death is not the only thing here. So I think Christians have a real opportunity here, not only with our theology, not only to reread text or reconsider our hermeneutic, but we have a real opportunity to embody hope. Many people in this country right now have no idea how we're going to go forward. Many of my gay friends are worried my marriage is going to be undone in 2 years. And listen, I'm a privileged person. That is not even one of the worst things that could happen to people, right? But I think we can't forget how to hope. Is it God's will? I don't know what God's will is, except in very general terms. I think of it more in terms of God's hope. God hopes that the world becomes what he knows it can be, right? God has front-loaded this world with a secret, with a promise, right? It's what Derrida would call the promise of the world.
Yeah.
And God hopes that the world makes good on it. And I think it's up to Christians to say, hey, look, a lot of things are dark right now. You're scared. We're scared too. And let's hope, because this world can be different, right? Even in our act of hoping, like this very small act, right? We don't have to focus all of our energies all the time on burning down these evil structures, right? Because what Jesus taught is when we undertake one concrete act, we've actually changed the entire structure. And that, to me, is a very hopeful thing.
I love that. No, that's really great. I think that that is a great note to end on, and I think it's giving me, I'm sure the audience, a lot to think about as we navigate the next couple of years coming up. Right, hope is really important. It's also an act of resistance. I feel like, just like how joy is. It's one of those things where it's like, no, they're not going to win in the sense of we're going to be discouraged all the time. We're going to be hopeful. We're going to do what we can. And we're also going to hope that that a better future is possible. So, well, Brandon, I really appreciate you making time. It really was amazing to meet you. I'm so glad that we're somewhat close to each other. We should try and make a coffee date or something and catch up in real time. The book you wrote is It God's Will? Making Sense of Tragedy, Luck, and Hope in a World Gone Wrong. The book is out now wherever books are sold. If people want to follow you, where can they follow your work? Do you have any public profiles?
Yeah, Instagram. I have a website. It's brandonambrosino.com, Instagram, Facebook, and I'm a columnist for Christian Century and for U.S. Catholic. I write a Theology for Kids column there.
I love that. Thank you for making time. It was really great.
It was great. Thanks so much. Take care.
Absolutely.